Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are working on this mini bike. This does not have any branding on it, so I'm not sure exactly what it used to be, but I'm thinking it is likely a 70s model, probably came with a 3-horse flathead Briggs or Tecumseh engine, and more recently was repowered with a 6.5-horse Predator engine. Anyway, this comes to us from a local subscriber, Philip, who is not able to use this machine anymore, so he gave it to us. He actually had it in his storage locker, and it's been there for a few years. So, likely the fuel system is going to have to be gone through. I did hear fuel sloshing around in the tank, so that's going to have to be cleaned up, and likely the carb as well. But I think we have bigger issues than just fuel. The throttle control appears to be damaged and not secured very well. And even more concerning is that when you actuate the throttle, it should be increasing the throttle down here, but instead, when I turn the throttle, it actually slows the engine down. So that kind of implies that if you let go of the throttle, it may potentially just run at wide open. So that we're going to have to take a closer look at. And even more concerning is the governor arm. It doesn't really seem to move, at least not like it should. So, we're going to have to dig in and fix the throttle situation as well as the governor and the fuel. And we actually have other issues on this mini bike as well, but I'm not going to focus in on any of that until we get the power plant up and running. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So to get access to the governor system, we actually need to pull the tank. And usually that's not a big deal. There's just a couple bolts right here, and I think a screw on the other side. But given the lack of clearance, I don't think we're gonna be able to lift the tank off to get access to that governor. So really what we need to do here is pull the engine out and do all the repairs and then put it back in. So I'm actually gonna level the machine out, just using some blocks of wood. This kickstand, although it's holding, I don't completely trust it. So once that's done, we'll find the master link, get the chain off, and pull a few bolts, and that engine should come right out. So I think something like this is probably going to work out fine. Interesting. So we don't have kind of a modern master link on this. It looks like instead we have a pin or a split pin or a cotter pin, whatever you want to call that, holding the chain pin in place. So let's get this out and slide the pin out of place. That should free the chain. Yeah, it looks like all I did was cut it off, unfortunately. But it is moving. Yeah, maybe I misread that. That is not moving. There we go. We're almost free. We have to disconnect the throttle. So it's just a set screw right here, and this wire should pull right out. So now that we have the tank off, let's get a look in here. So that is a good sign. The cap is rust-free, and that's usually a pretty good indicator of what you're going to see inside the tank. So yeah, tank looks fine. Fuel is definitely not fresh, and it kind of has that smell. Not the varnish smell, but definitely fuel that is well on its way to turning into varnish. So I think we caught it in time. So to get the tank off, it's just these two nuts under here, and we also have a bolt right there. We also have to pull the tank vent and actually the fuel line as well. So, to do that, probably the easiest way is just to disconnect it from the carb. So let's get the airbox off. We'll remove the fuel line, and then we can work on the tank. Pretty clean. Filter's in good shape. Although I'm surprised, actually, that it's just a little piece of foam. This is a clone of a Honda, and a Honda, an OEM one, actually has a much better filter. So, we could actually swap this out for an OEM style airbox, but given the clearance on this machine, I'm not sure we could actually do that. Anyway, let's pull these bolts right here. I think there's a screw on the top, and the rest of the airbox should pull right off. Huh. Whole stud came out. Which is actually a problem because the stud, it's tapered, or at least it's larger where it goes into the engine. So we can't pull it out, at least not through here, but I think we can pull the airbox off. We just have the breather line to disconnect. Actually, we don't need to disconnect it because it already is. Tank vent. So usually you do have to disconnect the breather, but it's already kind of disconnected and folded in. It's supposed to be over there onto the valve cover. But this line right above, that is the tank vent. And yeah, that stud's a problem. So it can't pull through the carburetor. So we're going to have to probably take the carb off as well, which is going to complicate things because we do need to disconnect a little bit more. So the spark plug wire is held on right there. So we'll get that out of the way. And we also need to disconnect the throttle linkage, which doesn't really move. And that is one of the reasons why we're in here. Actually, let's have another go at the stud. We'll try to hold it with some vice grips. And if the nut's not too stuck, it should come off. There we go. So you might as well keep going. We're going to have to fix the stud, and the best way to do that is to pull the carb. And likely it's going to have to be pulled anyway. Oh, look at that. The stud did come out. Okay. So you can see it is a little bit wider right there. I think that's what was hanging us up, at least getting through the airbox cover. Lift that off. Oh, actually it does move. Interesting. I swear that was not moving. So that's good. At least the governor control is intact. The throttle plate is not stuck. So that is good. But I do see we got something funky going on over here. Let me show you. And we actually have 3 springs right here. This one kind of looks like the OEM one, but it was moved. And then we have 2 extra. And the purpose of the OEM spring is a throttle return spring. But in this case, these 3 springs, they're holding it actually in wide open throttle. And the idle position is to the right. So yeah, we're going to have to correct that situation. The throttle cable too usually would come in and get secured by this bracket and then connect over to here. So that is one option. You could also come in this way and connect over to there and actually move this clamp, I think, over to that position. So we have 2 ways to connect the cable. The way that it was coming in from this side, there really isn't anything you can do except pull the throttle closed. So you really have to come in either from the left or from the front in order to work properly. So yeah, let's continue on. Let's get the tank off. You know, likely I'm going to swap out this entire control for a new one. And, you know, I guess while we're here, we'll have a look in the carb because, yeah, might as well. You know, likely that's going to need a bit of work. So we need to get the fuel line disconnected next. And the fuel valve is part of the carb. So as soon as we pull this line, we are going to start leaking fuel. So I do have a plug for the line we can put in temporarily, at least until we get the tank drained out. Interesting. The anti-surge spring is supposed to be connected right there in the carb. So instead it's up here on the bracket. So we'll make sure we put that in the right spot when we put this back together. We got one more screw. So let's start just by getting the stud back in. I'm going to use a bit of thread locker, and we'll double nut the other end and make sure it's snugged down. Actually, it looks like the threads are a little bit chewed up, so I can't spin it on any further than that. So let's clean up those threads a bit. But I think that was the reason why the stud came out. So this is supposed to be an M6 1.0. So I'm going to remove these arms because they're going to hit the other stud. And we'll use the tap just to clean it up. So I'm just tightening these two nuts up against each other. And once tight, then you use the outer wrench to turn the stud. So now the stud is tight in the block. Just loosen these up. And we should be good. So I'm just going to dump the contents of the tank out in this bin so you can kind of see what the fuel looks like. So yeah, not terrible. You know, this could definitely be mixed with some fresh fuel and reused. But you don't want it sitting around for too long, because I would say this is likely a couple years old, you know, at this point. So I think I'm going to use this brand new throttle control. You know, this one's unmodified. We have the throttle return spring right here. And this screw sets the max speed. So right now, the spring is holding it in the idle position. If we move it to the left, we increase the speed until we hit the max speed screw. And when we let go, you know, it springs back to idle. So that is the way it should be, at least on a stock Honda or Honda clone. And on this one, the throttle return spring was removed and actually put over here along with these two springs. So right now, it is against the max speed screw, and to slow it down, you would pull it to the right. And when you let go, it goes back to max speed. So technically, we could set this one back, but this original spring is likely a little bit stretched out, so I think We'll go with this one instead. So let's hook up the governor spring, and then we can bolt this down. So we'll have a look in the carb in a minute, and then I think the engine will be ready to test. But before we do that, let's get this plug out. You know, this is a torch plug, and that's what comes in actually a lot of clone engines. You know, they work okay, but they do tend to fail more often than a name brand. So I'm going to replace this plug with an NGK. BPR 6ES. Actually, it says LG F6TC. So, yeah, it doesn't say torch, but definitely not a name brand. All right, let's have a look in the carb. I'm just going to start by draining the bowl. That's usually a pretty good indicator of what we're going to find inside as far as the color of the fuel that comes out and if there's any rust or varnish on that bolt, which there's not. So that is a good sign. Fuel is old, but no water, no debris. Yeah, actually looks pretty clean. But let's just keep going. I want to make sure the jets are clear. I'm also going to check the fuel valve. Sometimes those can clog up. Needle looks good. Let's see if we can get the main jet out. There we go. It was stuck in there pretty good. A little dirty, but not bad. Main jet, though, might be clogged. I don't see any light through there, so let me shine a flashlight through there and just validate that. No, actually, I do see light coming through there. So the main jet was not clogged. You know, the overall condition seems to be pretty good. Let's check the pilot. And these are always pretty hard to tell if they're clogged up or not. You know, sometimes you can shine a light in the side, look down the center, and I'm not seeing any light. So the pilot might actually be clogged up. So we'll check that in a minute with a wire. See if it goes through. Huh. And these screws are pretty tight. Might need the impact for that. Nope, those are not coming out. So yeah, I don't want to cause a problem if there's not. So we can test if that works easy enough. Let's see if the sediment bowl will come out. Yeah, and that looks clean as well. So, I don't suspect that the valve is clogged up, just based on kind of everything else that I've seen here. Right now I'm actually in the on position, so, I can blow through this and air goes right through. So, yeah, the valve, it is not clogged. Yeah, pilot's open. So this carb is actually in good shape. I don't think it needs to go through the ultrasonic. There's really no reason to. So I'm going to put it back together, put it back on the machine, and I think we're ready to get the engine reinstalled. Okay, and this engine, it does idle, so we're going to have to reset the idle speed, once we get it up and running. So I do want to set this a little bit further in as a starting point. Yeah, about right like that. So let's get this back on the machine. I'm going to leave the airbox off for now because that'll block access here to this plate, which is where we need to connect the throttle cable. So we actually need to install the throttle cable onto the bike, route it approximately where it needs to be, get the engine installed, and then do the final step of connecting the cable. And then we can test it out, make sure it functions properly. So this one's already loose, comes off pretty easily. And I did buy a new one, which hopefully will fit. So we'll just get this tape off and we'll test fit the new one. And hopefully it works out. All right, so it fits on the handle, no issue. The next piece kind of clamps it in place. So before we put that on, we actually need to add the cable. So let's do that. And it's worth pointing out before we get the engine in place, we do have a scrub brake, and that seems to be fully functional. And I think I'm going to leave the oil alone. I did take a look at it earlier. It's actually filled right up to where it should be, and it looks brand new. So I think that is going to work out. It'll be just long enough to reach right here where it needs to go. The only issue is that I need to cut this end off. When I do that, the wire is going to fray. So I might try adding a little bit of solder right here before I cut that off, which might help hold that wire together just long enough to get it through and the set screw tightened down. The only catch is it still needs to fit through the hole. Hey, look at that. I melted the ends right off, so actually that might work to our advantage here. Or maybe not. Yeah, that might fit. Let's try it. Perfect. I'm going to leave the breather line disconnected for now because it is kinked due to the fact that it was folded. And, I'm just worried that's going to choke off the breather and that's going to cause all sorts of problems. So I do need to order one of those up. I'm going to get the tank vent reconnected, add a little bit of fuel, and I want to test it just like this. I want to make sure that the engine runs well, that it sounds good, and that we have good throttle control. So here's the real question. Can we get fuel in it? I think so. All right, the fuel is turned on, the choke is on, carb is filling up with fuel, and the ignition's on. Now, the chain, it's still disconnected, so there's no danger in this thing trying to drive off. Really, we just want to hear the engine, make sure it sounds good. Set the idle speed, make sure we have good throttle control. Okay, Let's bring the idle up a bit. Let's try that. All right, we'll try it with choke on. I think we're looking pretty good. The engine, it's running well. It sounds good. We did have to tweak a few settings. You know, the idle was a little low, so we brought that up. And the engine was actually over revving, but we do have good throttle control. So I did drive in the max speed set screw a few turns. You know, now we're topping out at about 3,600 RPM. So as far as the engine goes, you know, I think we're good. You know, I did pull the plate off because it was getting pretty hot. The exhaust was hitting it. The bottom of the seat's actually hot as well. And this cable, you know, it might be in jeopardy right here. I mean, the exhaust is coming out right below it, and this cable might heat up and potentially melt. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. But as far as the engine goes, I think we're looking pretty good. So before we can ride this, we need to fix the wheels. The back one doesn't hold air. The front one does, but the axles don't have lock nuts, and actually this one was loose. So I do want to swap those out. The other kind of big issue here is that the axles, they are 5/8 of an inch diameter, and the wheel is a little bit bigger. I think it's 3/4. So we need to fix that issue as well as this issue. And I think at least the front wheel will be good. We also have a speedometer as well. We have, well, what used to be a working speedometer. The cable actually doesn't spin anymore. So I'm going to remove the cable, probably remove the hardware as well for that, and move on to the back wheel. Yeah, and that is the problem. It's just kind of the wrong size bearing for this axle. So I did pick up a couple of bushings. These are 5/8 to 3/4. And theoretically, the bushing should fit. Yeah, there we go. So that snugs it up. You know, the bearings themselves, they're not in great shape. You know, they spin fine, but they, I wouldn't say are smooth. So, you know, I think they're going to have to be replaced at some point. The problem is, you know, on this side, we have this glued on, or actually JB welded on. It's held in place by quite a bit, although It is spinning. And it just came off. So yeah, actually we could replace these bearings at some point, but you know, for today, I just want to get this up and running. You know, it's a mini bike. I think these bearings will be good enough, probably for years to come. And we actually have a different option as well. This is a flanged bearing, so you don't need to run bearings all the way through like that. Instead, you know, this will sit and ride up against the inner race on the bearing that's in there right now. So that might actually work. Yeah, actually those work quite well. So we'll do the same to the other side and get this wheel reinstalled. And we also need a spacer on this side. That one might be a little small, but let's try it. Yeah, I think once we tighten down on the nut, that should cinch it together. Perfect. So now that we have this reducer bearing in place, there is absolutely no play in the front wheel. So let's do the same for the back. I'm pretty sure this is a split rim. So if I get this gear out of the way, that should provide access to the rim bolts. And we'll just split it and replace the tube. That one's loose. Well, it is a split rim, but it's still in there pretty good. There we go. And yeah, I think you can see why we're in here. Valve stem ripped right off. Interesting. And it was also pinched between the split rim, although I don't think that's the problem. It wasn't ripped there. All right, new tube going in. So it's probably easiest to get it in without any air in it. But before putting the rims back together, like sandwiching them together, put a little air in the tube to help it kind of spread out to where it should be. Okay. I'm going to use some new hardware to secure this and some nylock nuts, because the ones that were on there, a couple of them kind of loosened up a bit. So this should hold it without too much issue. And we'll do the same thing for this wheel. It's like the other. I think this one is 3/4. Though actually, maybe not. Might be a sloppy 5/8. Yeah. So it is actually 5/8 on both sides. So no need for that bushing. So we get the cable off. I'm going to leave the speedometer. It's a nice vintage speedometer. Kind of fits well with the bike. Maybe we can find a replacement cable, but for now, it's just kind of in the way. I've loosened up the engine mount bolts a bit. That way we can fine tune the chain tension. So we'll get the pin back in, and I'm not sure if I have a cotter pin that small. Hopefully I do. Yeah, it's almost going through. You know what it is? The wire is just too thick. I can get one through, but not both. So might just go with one. I can still bend it over on each side. And that should get us up and running. So technically, this should run and drive, and I'm really tempted to bring it outside and try it out. But, I think my earlier assessment of the condition of the bearings was a little bit overly optimistic, because now that it's together and I can spin the wheel, I can really hear just how bad that bearing is. Let me hold the mic up so you can hear. Yeah, it's not good. And I'm really concerned that it's going to lock up, and I know my kids are going to want to drive this. So I've done a little bit of research to figure out what to order, and that has actually been ordered. It'll be here in about a week. But while doing that research, I actually found some vintage MiniBike pictures of a Manco streaker, and that seems to be a match for what we have here. Anyway, while we wait for that, there's kind of one more thing I want to look at, and that's the original ignition switch. The Predator has its own, but if that switch up here still works, I'd like to wire that in as well. So let's test it real quick, and if it's good, then we will connect it up to the engine. So to test the switch, I'm just going to use the multimeter set in continuity mode. So when the leads touch, that meter beeps. So we'll connect one lead to each terminal. Like that. And when it's in the off position, we should hear it beep. And actually, according to this plaque right here, this label, it says off. And I don't hear anything. If we flip it to on, we get a signal. So the switch works, but the plate is actually backwards. So let's spin that around, connect up some wires, and wire it to the engine. And it's actually keyed, meaning I can't rotate it. Let me just see if it's keyed on both sides. No, it's not. So interesting. And yeah, when it's off, we get no signal, and when it's on, we do. So the label is backwards. So I'm thinking we should probably just cut off that little nub that keys it in, and then we can rotate it around to be correct. And the key that we just ground off was right there. So now we want to have that opposite. And I guess the only downside is that it's going to spin a little bit. But it should be right most of the time, whereas before it would have been wrong all the time. All right, so we'll start just by stripping these wires back. And we're going to put 2 eyelets on, crimp them down, and attach it to the switch. So to make the switch work, we need to connect one wire to any source of ground, and the other wire has to be part of this circuit right here. This is the one that ultimately runs over to the ignition coil. You know, right now we have the ignition switch on the engine tied in, as well as the oil sensor. So I'm thinking we just probably tap in right here. I have this lead from another generator. And then we actually need to split it. You know, one to connect in here and the other one over here. But I'm thinking instead of splitting it like they did here, we could actually use one bullet connector and connect this wire and that wire in the same connector. So let's cut off these ends and put the ones on we need. So I'm going to use the red wire as the ground wire, which admittedly is not the best choice, but we do have a black circuit already. So I want to use that black wire there to keep it consistent. So this eyelet will just connect probably right to there to pick up engine ground. And this actually, yeah, let's cut that. All right, so the ground wire is connected. And we just need to put this one in circuit. And that should do it. So let me secure the wire, and then we'll test it out. All right, let's give this a try. We'll turn this switch on. The switch on the engine's also on. If either one is turned off, it's not gonna start. So that's probably the only downside of two switches. So let's get the engine started. I've also got the back wheel off the ground so we can test the clutch as well. The good news is the switch seems to work fine, as well as the clutch. But now that we have the back wheel spinning at speed, I can see we have issues with the rim and the tire, and that kind of just adds to the problem that we have here with the bearings. So yeah, might be doing a little shopping for a back wheel as well. Well, it's been a few days and we have the wheels we need to finish up this project. So both of these came from BMI Carts, not a sponsor, but they do have a great selection of parts, and the price wasn't bad either. This is a complete new wheel. It is the exact right size, and it has good bearings that are also the correct diameter. So I think this was only about 23 bucks, and I was also able to locate a new rear 5-inch rim that can accept a sprocket. This one did come with ball bearings. They are not installed. They're actually chilling in the freezer. So we're gonna have to get those installed. And I also picked up a new tire as well. This one, it's unclear if it's deformed or warped. And given that it's gonna be a lot of effort to get this onto that, I wanna make sure that the tire we're working with is good. So I'm gonna start here. Let's try to get this new tire onto the new rim. So I'm hoping this goes right on, but they almost never do. And it was about this time last year, I was actually trying to put one on, and I was pushing so hard, I actually snapped the vise right in half. Guess I'm buying a new vise. I knew it was undersized, and this day was gonna come. Geez, today's the day. So I'm hoping to not have a repeat of that. And this piece I might have to omit. Might not allow me to get the spoons in there properly. And as far as I can tell, this tire can go on in either direction. With my luck, I'd get it on, then I'll find the arrow telling me I did it wrong. And yeah, this is where the fun begins. So because the diameter is so small, I'm going to be fighting with this center post quite a bit. You know, it's just so close. Okay, well, that wasn't too bad. We're halfway there. So I'm going to use some vice grips here on the rim. It helps quite a bit to hold, you know, the bead from popping off completely. And I'm going to eliminate this piece here. It just helps center the rim on the tire changer tool, but it's just not enough room really to get the tire spoon in there. Ow. All right, let's get this thing beaded up and get the bearings installed. So I was going to use the vise to press the bearings in, but yeah, hindsight being 2020, now that the tire's on, you know, I don't think that's going to work out. We just can't get down to the jaws. So instead, I'm just going to heat this up a bit with the heat gun, and then we'll just tap the bearings in place using the right size socket. I'm pretty sure the hub offset is a little bit different. You know, the new one, it is centered, but I think it's comes out a little further, so we might have to swap out for some different spacers to get it to fit right. Interesting. So I was wrong. This is not a centered hub. If I turn this around, you can see this side goes out pretty much all the way. So I'm thinking on this side, we don't really need a spacer, although we might need one to get it truly centered. So let's try that. Yeah, much better. And most importantly, if I hold the microphone up to it, don't hear anything. There is a slight wobble, so even the new rim's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what was on there. Perfect. So let's do the back. And as far as the sprocket goes, I actually ended up ordering a new one because it wasn't clear to me if the hub on the new wheel was the same. You know, I took the measurements here of the bolt circle, and I got, I think it was 2.75 inches. The new hub said 2 7/8. And actually this one I ordered said 2.9. So none of them agree. I have a feeling that they're probably all the same. But we got a new one, so let's get that one installed. And I am reusing the hardware because I did not buy any new hardware, and there's nothing wrong with the hardware on the old wheel. And this is also using 420 chain. The original chain on this mini bike actually was number 35. So this is a pretty big upgrade and definitely what you want for the engine that's on there right now. So the hub side on this wheel, it's inset quite a bit. So before, at least on the close side, we only had a washer as a spacer, but this time we're actually going to need a spacer to bring that out. And then we need a couple of these large washers to center the chain to the clutch. That is a million times better. Look at how perfect that is. And of course, no more slop. So I think we do need to add a spacer to the other side. Then we can tighten this down, add the chain, and we're almost done. There's actually one more thing I want to do. Probably the smaller one because I don't want it rubbing against the hub or the outer race. Yeah, there's a little bit too much slop in there, so let me try to get another washer in there. So I found a pretty thin washer that might work here. You know, I want to keep this still because if it is able to kind of slide back and forth on the axle, then, you know, the chain, it's going to go out of center versus the clutch, and that could cause some damage. But yeah, this actually, I think it's going to work out. Yeah, I think that's acceptable. Tiny bit of play, and once I tighten this up, it's probably going to take that play out. Yeah, that's pretty good. Don't really want to put too much preload on that inner race because the bearing will kind of lock up. I think I can add a little bit more because we do still have a tiny bit of play. Bearing still feels good. And virtually no play. So I'm going to call that one for the win. So I picked up this deflector. It just bolts on right there. And what that's going to do is direct the hot exhaust air away from the cable and also the license plate, which I plan on re-adding. I'm just going to add these zip ties on the bottom, I guess for a couple of reasons. The main one is probably to keep it from rattling so much. And it's also going to provide some backup. These are just self-tappers, and they're not stripped out, but I wouldn't call them super tight either. Actually, this one, yeah, need to tighten that a little more. Perfect. All right, so we'll get the chain on. I did loosen up the engine mounts. What I'm noticing though is that this hub is a little bit closer to the wheel, so that pin, I don't think I can come at it the same way as before. Meaning the pin comes out, the cotter pin's on the outside. I think I actually have to reverse it to have any chance of getting this together. I think we're as ready as we're going to get. So let's try this thing out. Scrub brake does work. Although this hill is pretty steep, I'm not sure it's going to come across very well, so I'm not sure if I trust the brake, but so far it's holding me back. Wow. I just gave it a little bit of throttle on this thing. It's got a lot of torque. Yeah, it's driving pretty well. A lot better than I thought. If I'm not careful, I might end up pulling a wheelie. So when that clutch grabs, it takes off. Yeah, not too bad. I'm not going to drive it too far in the neighborhood because there's a lot of hills and I don't trust the scrub brake enough to go on those hills, although I'm sure I can go up the hills, no problem. More concerned about going down. not too bad. Well, this one definitely caught me by surprise. You know, the original engine was about 3.5 horsepower, and the replacement is about twice that. So I knew it was going to be fast, but what I wasn't expecting was the clutch. I think this is a high stall clutch because it doesn't really engage until you throttle it up. You know, I would say at least 2,500 RPM. And once the clutch engages, you know, this thing takes off like a rocket ship. You know, I felt the front wheel getting light on several occasions. So, you know, if you're not careful, I would say this could definitely pull a wheelie. Anyway, the other thing I noticed was balance. You had to pay attention because these little wheels combined with this big engine and the flywheel hanging off the side makes it a little bit tricky. You know, a few times I was starting to get into a death wobble. It was a little bit hard to control. So you definitely want to pay attention when riding this. You know, as far as the diverter goes, I think that solved the problem as far as things heating up back here because the plate stayed cool as well as the throttle cable. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.